They called it a victory. Trumpets sounded, banners were raised, and messengers carried the news across cities and kingdoms. On paper, the enemy had been defeated, the objective achieved, the war won. Yet on the battlefield itself, there was no feeling of triumph. The ground was soaked in blood, the air heavy with smoke, and the silence that followed felt louder than any celebration. This was the kind of victory that left no one untouched, no one truly victorious. History often teaches us to celebrate winners. We memorize their names, repeat their slogans, and mark their triumphs as turning points. But some victories are so violent, so consuming, that they raise an uncomfortable question. What if winning costs more than losing ever could? What if success itself becomes a form of destruction? As the sun set over the battlefield, survivors looked around in disbelief. Friends were gone. Commanders lay silent. Entire units had been erased in a matter of hours. The enemy had retreated, yes, but so had hope. What remained was exhaustion, grief, and a creeping realization that something irreversible had occurred. This was not the clean, heroic victory promised before the first sword was drawn. Leaders would later describe this moment as necessary, unavoidable, even glorious. Official records would speak of bravery and sacrifice, of a hard-fought triumph against overwhelming odds. But for those who stood among the bodies, victory felt hollow. Every step forward had been paid for with lives that could never be replaced. Every gain carried a weight that pressed down on the soul. This is the paradox of the bloodiest victories in history. They deliver exactly what was demanded of them, yet leave behind a broken force, a wounded society, and a future filled with uncertainty. The line between triumph and tragedy blurs until it becomes impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. In moments like these, celebration becomes muted, almost shameful. There are no cheers loud enough to drown out the memories, no medals heavy enough to justify the cost. Winning keeps the nation alive, but it scars it deeply, changing it forever. Even the soldiers who survived would carry this day with them, not as a story of glory, but as a memory of loss. Long after the weapons fell silent, the echoes of that victory would continue to shape decisions, fears, and ambitions. To understand how such a victory could happen, we must look beyond the final outcome. We must return to the world that existed before the blood was spilled, before confidence hardened into certainty, and before leaders convinced themselves that this battle could be won without consequence. Because the roots of this devastating triumph were planted long before the first blow was struck. That earlier world was filled with optimism, ambition, and dangerous assumptions, a place where belief in strength outweighed caution, and where the promise of victory blinded many to the fragile reality beneath their confidence. That is where this story truly begins, in history. Before the first blade was raised and before the first order was shouted, the world surrounding this battle felt strangely calm. Nations stood tall, convinced of their own strength. Leaders spoke with certainty, their words heavy with confidence and promise. In council halls and public squares, victory was treated not as a possibility, but as a foregone conclusion. The question was never if they would win, only how quickly it would happen. This confidence did not appear overnight. It was built layer by layer through past successes, expanding borders, and carefully controlled stories of strength. Each previous win reinforced the belief that this army was different, superior, almost untouchable.
Losses from earlier conflicts were explained away as learning experiences, temporary setbacks on an unstoppable rise. Pride quietly replaced caution. Among the people, the mood was hopeful, even excited. Songs were sung about the coming triumph. Families watched their sons and daughters march away, believing they would return as heroes. War was framed as a necessary step towards stability,
honor, and lasting peace. Few questioned the cost, because few believed the cost would be extreme. The enemy, after all, was described as weaker, disorganized, already on the verge of collapse. Inside the ranks, soldiers absorbed these narratives completely. Training camps buzzed with energy and bravado. Many believed they were about to participate in a defining moment of history, one that would be remembered for generations. Fear existed, but it was buried beneath discipline and expectation. They trusted their commanders, trusted their strategies, and trusted the idea that they were on the right side of destiny. Leaders themselves were not immune to illusion. Surrounded by advisors who echoed their confidence, doubts were quietly dismissed. Warnings were softened, risks minimized, and worst-case scenarios pushed aside. Planning focused on success, not survival. The belief in inevitable victory became so strong that it shaped every decision, leaving little room for humility or restraint. Politically, the stakes demanded confidence. Backing down was unthinkable. Prestige, alliances, and authority rested on the promise of success. To hesitate would signal weakness, and weakness could unravel everything built so far. So the path forward became locked, driven as much by pride as by strategy. In this atmosphere, war felt almost abstract. Numbers on maps, movements on paper, timelines drawn with certainty. The human cost was acknowledged, but only in theory. No one truly imagined the scale of what was coming. Optimism acted like armor, protecting minds from uncomfortable truths. This was the world before the battle, hopeful, proud, and dangerously convinced of its own narrative. A world where belief overshadowed reality, and confidence drowned out caution. It was a fragile balance, held together by assumptions that had never been tested under true pressure. Soon, that illusion would be shattered. When steel met flesh and plans collided with chaos, every belief forged in comfort would face its reckoning, and the myth of inevitable victory would begin to crack, revealing what lay beneath. This battle was never just another clash between armies. By the time the first orders were given, too much had already been invested to allow failure. Land was at stake, not just soil and borders, but strategic ground that controlled trade routes, defenses, and future expansion. Losing it would mean exposing the heart of the nation, inviting enemies closer, and undoing years of hard-won gains in a single stroke. Survival itself seemed to hang in the balance. Leaders framed the conflict as an existential struggle, one where defeat would not simply delay progress, but threaten the nation's very existence. Stories circulated of what would happen if the enemy prevailed. Cities burned, people enslaved, culture erased. Whether fully accurate or carefully exaggerated, these narratives served one purpose: to make retreat unthinkable. Beyond territory and survival lay ideology. This battle represented competing visions of the world, of who had the right to rule and whose beliefs would shape the future. Victory meant validation. It meant proof that their system, their values, their way of life was stronger and more legitimate than the alternative. Losing would not only weaken power, it would undermine belief, shaking the foundation of authority at home and respect abroad. Honor also played a decisive role. Promises had been made publicly, oaths sworn before allies and citizens alike. Reputations of leaders, generals, and entire institutions were bound to the outcome. To lose would be to invite shame, rebellion, and political collapse. In cultures where honor defined legitimacy, defeat could be as destructive as invasion. For the soldiers, the stakes were deeply personal. Retreat was associated with disgrace, cowardice, and betrayal of fallen comrades. Many believed that if they did not hold the line, everything they loved would be lost. This belief forged determination, but it also removed the option of restraint. When victory becomes the only acceptable outcome, every other consideration fades. Strategically, alternatives were slowly stripped away. Diplomacy had failed or been abandoned. Compromise was seen as weakness. Each step forward made turning back more costly, until leaders found themselves trapped by their own commitments. The battle became a point of no return, a moment where the future would be decided by force alone. This is why the battle could not be lost, not because victory was easy, but because defeat was unimaginable. The cost of winning was terrifying, yet the cost of losing was framed as absolute ruin. Faced with that choice, leaders and soldiers alike accepted a grim reality. Whatever price victory demanded, it would be paid. And so, when the armies finally moved toward each other, they did so with a shared understanding. This was not a fight they could walk away from. The outcome would shape borders, beliefs, and lives for generations. Everything now depended on what would happen when preparation met chaos, and when these impossible stakes collided with the brutal reality of battle. The moment finally arrived without ceremony. No speech could prepare them for what followed.
The first clash exploded across the field in a wave of sound. Metal striking metal, bodies colliding, order shouted and instantly lost in the noise. What had once been lines on a map dissolved into chaos. The battle was no longer an idea or a strategy. It was happening, everywhere, all at once. Fear surged through the ranks like electricity. Training took over where thought failed. Soldiers moved forward because stopping meant death. The air filled with dust, smoke, and the sharp smell of blood. Screams cut through the roar, some from pain, others from rage or desperation. Every step demanded a choice. Every heartbeat carried risk. There was no time to reflect, only to react. As formations collapsed, the battlefield fractured into countless individual struggles. Men fought face to face, close enough to see terror in each other's eyes. Armor dented, shields splintered, and weapons slipped from numb hands.
The enemy was no longer a distant force, but a living, breathing presence pressing in from all sides. Adrenaline drowned out exhaustion, pushing bodies beyond their limits. Commanders shouted orders, but control was fragile. Messages arrived too late or not at all. Plans carefully built over months unraveled in minutes, as reality refused to follow expectation. Units advanced too far, others hesitated, and gaps opened where none were supposed to exist. In those gaps, lives vanished. Time lost its meaning. Moments stretched endlessly, then vanished in a blur. A second could decide survival. One misstep, one glance away, and everything ended. Soldiers fought not for banners or ideology, but for the simple instinct to stay alive. The ground grew slick beneath their feet, making every movement more dangerous. Despite the chaos, momentum slowly shifted. Somewhere amid the noise, pressure built against the enemy. Lines bent, then buckled. Victory, long promised, began to feel possible.
But it came hand in hand with mounting loss. For every step gained, bodies were left behind. The battlefield expanded into a vast graveyard in real time. Hope and horror advanced together. Cheers rose briefly, only to be silenced by fresh waves of violence. The price of progress became impossible to ignore. Soldiers pressed forward, knowing that success demanded sacrifice, and that survival was never guaranteed. By the time the fighting reached its most brutal peak, there was no turning back. Steel met flesh again and again, carving the future into the present. This was the moment where destiny was decided, not by ideals, but by endurance. And as the battle raged on, the cost of victory began to reveal itself, one fallen body at a time. The shift did not come with celebration. It arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, hidden inside exhaustion and confusion. Somewhere in the chaos, the enemy began to give ground.
Their attacks slowed, their formations loosened, and the pressure that had felt endless suddenly eased. Officers sensed it before soldiers did. The tide was turning. Word spread unevenly across the field. A position had been taken. A flank was holding. Reinforcements had arrived just in time. Small victories stacked on top of one another until a larger truth became impossible to deny. They were winning. The objective that once seemed distant now felt within reach. For a brief moment, hope cut through the smoke. But this hope was fragile. It rose alongside a mounting awareness of loss. The battlefield was littered with the price already paid. Medics moved frantically among the wounded, forced to choose who might live and who was beyond saving. Cries for help echoed unanswered as fighting continued around them. Victory demanded attention. Mercy had to wait. As pressure mounted on the enemy, resistance grew more desperate.
Retreating forces fought with nothing left to lose, turning every advance into a slaughter. Each step forward cost lives, and the ground gained was measured in bodies. Soldiers began to realize that survival itself was becoming a matter of chance. Commanders pushed harder, knowing hesitation could reverse everything. Orders became ruthless. There was no room for pause, no space for reflection. Momentum had to be maintained at any cost. The logic was simple and terrifying. Stop now, and everything already sacrificed would be meaningless. For those fighting, emotions clashed violently. Relief mixed with horror. Pride collided with grief. They could feel victory approaching, yet it no longer felt like something to celebrate. Friends who had stood beside them hours earlier were gone. Faces blurred together, living and dead indistinguishable in memory. The scale of loss became undeniable. Entire units were reduced to fragments of their former strength.
Veterans with years of experience fell alongside those who had seen combat for the first time. The army was winning, but it was being hollowed out from the inside. Hope and despair advanced together, inseparable. Every success carried a shadow. Every breakthrough revealed another wave of casualties. It became clear that something fundamental had been broken, and that even a complete victory would not restore it. By the time the enemy finally began to collapse, the realization settled in like a weight. Yes, they would win. History would record it as a triumph. But standing amid the devastation, many understood that the cost had crossed an invisible line. Whatever this victory achieved, it had already taken something that could never be reclaimed. When the fighting finally stopped, it did not end with cheers. It ended with silence. A silence so heavy it felt unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath.
The clash of steel faded, the shouting died away, and what remained was a battlefield frozen in aftermath. Smoke drifted slowly across the ground, revealing what victory had truly left behind. Bodies lay where they had fallen, scattered across the field in chaotic patterns that told the story of the battle better than any chronicle ever could. Some were motionless, others still clinging weakly to life, their breathing shallow and uncertain. The wounded cried out softly now, no longer in the heat of combat, but in pain, shock, and disbelief. Medics moved among them, overwhelmed, knowing they could not save everyone. Survivors stood in place, unsure what to do next. Weapons slipped from trembling hands. Armor felt heavier than it ever had before. Faces were streaked with blood and dirt, eyes hollow, searching for familiar figures that would never answer back. Victory had arrived, yet it brought no relief. Only exhaustion and grief settled in its wake.
There were no speeches in that moment, no sense of accomplishment, just the slow realization of what had been lost. Friends, brothers, leaders, entire futures erased in a single day. The battlefield had become a graveyard, and those still standing were forced to walk through it, step by careful step. The smell lingered, iron, smoke, and death mixed into the air. It was a scent no one would ever forget. Every breath carried memory, every glance another reminder that nothing could undo what had happened. The enemy was gone, defeated, but the cost of defeating them was now impossible to ignore. Celebration felt inappropriate, almost offensive. How could anyone rejoice when the ground beneath their feet was soaked with sacrifice? The idea of victory felt abstract, distant, stripped of meaning by the reality surrounding them. Winning had not restored order,
or brought peace. It had only exposed how fragile both truly were.
As night fell, fires burned low across the field, casting shadows over the fallen. Survivors gathered the dead when they could, marking positions, whispering names, promising remembrance. Some stared silently into the darkness, already haunted by images they would carry for the rest of their lives. This silence was not empty. It was filled with questions no one could answer. Was this worth it? Could anything justify this scale of loss? The battle was over, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. In that quiet aftermath, one truth became clear. Victory had not given them something new. It had taken something irreplaceable. And as the army prepared to move forward, weakened and grieving, the silence followed them, a constant reminder that the war might be won, but nothing would ever be the same again. The victory was announced, but the army that emerged from the battlefield barely resembled the force that had entered it. What remained was fractured, exhausted, and uncertain.
Units that once moved with discipline and confidence now struggled to reorganize. Command structures were strained, leaders dead or wounded, chains of command weakened by sudden gaps that could not easily be repaired. Morale suffered first. Soldiers who had survived carried the weight of what they had seen and done. Pride in victory existed, but it was fragile, overshadowed by grief and fatigue. The sense of invincibility that once defined them was gone. They had won, but they no longer believed themselves untouchable. Every scar, every empty place in formation, served as proof of how close they had come to collapse. Leadership faced its own crisis. Decisions that secured victory were now questioned in private, even if praised in public. Officers struggled to balance authority with empathy, knowing that pushing too hard might shatter what little cohesion remained. Trust had been tested, and while it had not fully broken, it was no longer absolute. Logistically, the army was stretched thin. Supplies meant for expansion were redirected to survival. Replacements were scarce, and those who arrived lacked the experience of the fallen. The force had grown weaker even as its territory expanded. Strength on paper masked vulnerability in reality. Politically, the victory demanded results. Allies expected dominance. Rivals watched closely for signs of weakness. Yet inside the camps, uncertainty ruled. Soldiers wondered how many more battles like this they could endure. Leaders wondered whether another victory of this kind would destroy them entirely. The contrast was stark. Publicly, banners still flew, and history would record success. Privately, the army nursed its wounds, aware that it stood on unstable ground. Winning had preserved power, but it had also exposed limits that could no longer be ignored. This hollow victory left the future unclear. Expansion now carried risk. Defense felt fragile. Every decision ahead would be shaped by the memory of how close they had come to breaking. The army still stood, but it did so on unsteady legs. Strength and weakness coexisted uneasily. Triumph masked trauma. Survival replaced ambition. The victory had secured the present, but it had endangered everything that came next. And as the army looked toward the horizon, one question lingered unspoken. If this was the price of winning, how much more could they afford to lose? When the noise of battle faded and the wounds of the body began to heal, another kind of damage quietly took hold. It was invisible, rarely discussed, and almost never celebrated. The mind carried what the armor could not protect against. For many who survived, the war did not end when the fighting stopped. It followed them home. Soldiers replayed the battle in fragments. Faces of the fallen appeared without warning. Sounds returned in moments of silence. Sleep became unreliable, broken by memories that refused to stay buried. Some felt guilt for surviving when others had not. Others questioned the choices they made in moments of fear, wondering if a single second could have changed everything. There was little space to speak about this pain. Victory demanded strength, not vulnerability. Heroes were expected to move on, to stand proudly behind the banners of success. Admitting fear or doubt felt like betrayal, not only of comrades but of the victory itself. So many suffered quietly.
carrying their scars alone. The impact reached far beyond the battlefield. Families noticed the change. The same people returned, yet something essential was missing. Laughter felt forced. Silence grew longer. Relationships strained under emotions no one knew how to explain. Society welcomed its victors, but struggled to understand what the war had taken from them. Communities also absorbed the trauma. Loss became widespread, normalizing grief on a massive scale. Entire generations grew up shaped by absence. The victory that was meant to secure the future instead left it emotionally fractured. Memorials honored the dead, but offered little comfort to the living. Guilt lingered heavily. Some questioned whether the cost had been justified. Others clung desperately to the belief that it had to be worth it, because accepting otherwise would make the suffering unbearable. This internal conflict became its own kind of battlefield, one without clear victories or endings. Leaders spoke of sacrifice in noble terms, but for many, those words rang hollow. Sacrifice sounded different when lived day after day. It sounded like nightmares, distance, and a quiet ache that never fully disappeared. These wounds were harder to measure than casualties, but no less real. The deepest scars were the ones no one applauded. They did not earn medals or monuments.
They shaped behavior, decisions, and fears long after the war faded from headlines. They influenced how future conflicts were viewed, how risks were weighed, and how trust was rebuilt. In time, history would remember the battle as a turning point, a decisive victory. But beneath that narrative lived countless personal stories, marked by trauma and loss. Stories rarely told, yet essential to understanding the true cost of winning. And as society moved forward, carrying both pride and pain, these unseen scars quietly set the stage for how this victory would be remembered, reshaped, and mythologized in the years to come. As time passed, the story of this battle began to change. What was once remembered in blood and grief slowly transformed into legend. Historians condensed chaos into timelines. Pain was edited into purpose. The victory was polished, simplified, and retold until it became something easier to celebrate and harder to question. Official accounts focused on outcomes, not consequences. Maps showed expanded borders. Records highlighted strategic brilliance and decisive leadership. Numbers were reduced to statistics, stripped of faces and names. In textbooks and speeches, the battle became a symbol of strength, proof of dominance. The narrative was clear and comforting. The cost was high, but necessary. The victory was worth it. Any doubts were softened or omitted entirely. Complexity gave way to clarity, because clarity was easier to pass down. But this version of history left much behind. It rarely spoke of the broken army that followed. It did not dwell on the trauma carried home by survivors, or the communities permanently altered by loss.